اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين ألف لام ميم.
إلهي عظم البلاء وبرح الخفاء وانكشف الغطاء وانقطع الرجاء وضاقت الأرض ومنعت السماء وأنت المستعان وإليك المشتكى وعليك المعول في الشدة والرخاء. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد أولي الأمر الذين فرضت علينا طاعتهم وعرفتنا بذلك منزلتهم ففرج عنا بحقه فرجا عاجلا قريبا كلمح البصر أو هو أقرب. يا محمد يا علي يا علي يا محمد اكفياني فإنكما كافيان وانصراني فإنكما ناصران. يا مولانا يا صاحب الزمان الغوث 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 أدركني 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 الساعة 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 العجب العجب العجب. يا أرحم الراحمين بحق محمد وآله الطاهرين.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا وحبيبنا وطبيب نفوسنا وشفيع نفوسنا أبي القاسم محمد اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين الصادقين. Respected viewers, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. This week's topic, we discuss something that many see as a controversial topic, one that is a part of everyone's day-to-day lives, and something that we refer back to on a daily basis, whether it be rulings or something that we need if we're in a pickle or in a certain specific situation and whatnot. And that topic is maraja'. Our maraja' are looked at as the most respected amongst the scholars, and obviously the scholars that have the highest of positions after their lengthy studies and their analysis into the religion of Islam and its texts and whatnot. However, with tonight's show, we did want to start off, inshallah, by introducing Sayyid Mahdi Al-Mudarrisi as the speaker. Sayyid, Assalamu alaikum.
Alaykum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Haj Ali, may Allah bless you, inshallah.
Thank you, Sayyid, and likewise. Sayyid, we'll begin tonight's lecture with a bit on the occasion that's happened in Lebanon, as I'm sure everyone is aware. So, inshallah, if you can start with a condolence introduction and whatnot on that, and then inshallah we can move on to tonight's topic.
Absolutely.
Faddal.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء وسيد المرسلين وحبيب إله العالمين أبي القاسم محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المكرمين الغرر الميامين سيما بقية الله في الأراضين وحجته على الخلائق أجمعين سيدنا وإمام زماننا وصاحب نعمتنا وولي أمرنا مهدي هذه الأمة وطاووس أهل الجنة الحجة بن الحسن العسكري فداه أرواح العالمين. I think we are all shocked and extremely saddened by the horrific blast that we saw in Beirut, an explosion that has caused extreme damage, but worst of all, a great loss of life. Thousands of people are reportedly injured, hospitals are overwhelmed, and really the saddest part about this is that Lebanon is a country that has seen its fair share of tragedies and of suffering. And it's going through a particularly difficult time at the moment. And I know from my Lebanese friends that the situation there economically is extremely difficult. Half the country is reportedly living under the poverty line. Many people are finding it extremely difficult to get basic necessities. Apparently, in the blast that took place at Beirut port, a vast majority of the country's wheat reservoirs were also destroyed. Medicine reservoirs have also been destroyed. And there's the environmental impact on the city of Beirut as well. So we stand in solidarity with the people of Beirut, with the people of Lebanon, and pray. I think, more than anything at this point, at this juncture, many of you around the world are probably thinking that there's not much you can do, but there is something you can do. Ad-du'a'u silahul mu'min. Dua is the weapon of the believer. Dua is something that our imams have told us can repel tragedy, and it can avert the most devastating things. And if there is nothing we can do, the very least we can offer is prayers and du'as for the reappearance of our master, our imam. The ultimate cure to all of the endemic and systemic problems of the world today is the awaited savior. So a special prayer for the imam, as we did earlier in the show, inshallah. And our prayers also go out to those who are injured, to the families that have lost loved ones. May Allah give them patience, and may Allah bless them all.
Ahsan Sayyid.
Ahsantum, barakallah.
Sayyid, so just Jazakumullah for the for what you've just told our audience, and inshallah it goes out to the people of Lebanon, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala help the people of Lebanon. You know, no matter what you are, at the end of the day, it's all innocent lives that have been affected by what's happened. You know, and as Imam Ali alayhi salam says, people are of two kinds, either your brother in faith or your equal in humanity. So we definitely do send our condolences from the team at The Guided to everyone in Lebanon, all the families, and inshallah, I believe there are a lot of people in Australia that have put fundraising causes together and GoFundMe pages in order to raise money. So inshallah, we are doing what we can from our end, and hopefully we will be rewarded accordingly.
Inshallah.
Sayyid, tonight's topic, we'll move on to the controversial stuff now. Tonight's topic, maraja, something that is a part of all of our lives, something that you're told from a young age, you need to follow a marja in order for you to move out of this phase of being confused and not knowing how to address certain actions and certain mistakes and whatnot. So we begin with tonight's question. What is a marja?
I think everyone recognizes, especially with the awareness that we have of the, let's say, I mean, we just mentioned Beirut, Lebanon. You look at around the world, you see so many problems, so many challenges. And so for someone like yourself or your respected audience, it's not too difficult to make the case for the necessity of marja'iyah. And the reason for that is the position of leadership is a critical one. We all recognize that for the last 14 centuries, we, as the followers of the Ahlul Bayt, have been at the receiving end of much pain and misery because of a mistake that was made during the selection process for the leader after the Prophet's demise, right? We are victims of Saqifa. And much of the pain, much of the misery, much of the carnage, the bloodshed that we see today, if we were to reverse engineer it, it would all go back to that one singular point when one person says, I will give you allegiance to be my leader. And before we know it, that set in motion a series of events which has led the world to the abysmal place that it is right now. And so the position of leadership is extremely important. There's no question there. In Islam, we have traditions where the Prophet and the subsequent Imams would emphasize the importance of leadership to the extent where they would say that if there were 2 or 3 people traveling together, then they should select one among them to be the leader. Now think about this. You're going on a little weekend getaway. There is you and 2 or 3 of your buddies. Islam teaches us that we should get together before the trip takes place, and a leader has to be selected. That it can't just be, I mean, a democracy is a good thing, but even in a democracy, you need a leader at the top, and then everybody sort of delegating their authorities, their rights to this individual to make the strategic decisions for the group. And so that is the Islamic view as well. Now, to answer your question, a marja is a leader who has the best grasp on religious rules as well as the moral teachings of Islam. That's basically what it all comes down to in a nutshell. A marja is a leader, but not just any leader. Because let's compare and contrast the marja'iyya system in the Shia world with what you have in the Sunni world. In the Sunni world, a marja is essentially a bureaucrat, right? They don't call it a marja, they call it a mufti, for example. But essentially what happens is the government selects an individual to head the religious institution. Let's say Al-Azhar in Egypt. The head of the Al-Azhar University and ultimately the mufti of the country is selected by the president of Egypt. The president of Egypt is most likely someone who got to power through a coup, right? It could be a bloodthirsty monster who ends up indirectly giving people religious directions because he's the one who selects the mufti. So the ultimate qualification for a mufti is that he needs to be a good bootlicker and someone who can get along with the political establishment. Now, that doesn't take away from his knowledge of jurisprudence according to their school of thought. Ultimately, he would have to have some kind of, he'd have to have acceptance among his peers to an extent. But at the end of the day, the person who gets selected is selected because he's not deemed a threat, he is obedient to the ruling elite, and so he's appointed that way. Whereas in the Shia world, a marja is number one, a leader, as we said. And we talked about the importance of having a leader. Number two, someone who is religiously educated to the point where he is, if not the single most knowledgeable person when it comes to religious affairs, at least among the top, echelon of the scholars of the field. And number three, he has to be pious, which means that any affiliation to the political establishment, any attempt to gain worldly things for himself. In other words, the reason he's taken this position is to be able to rule over everybody else, will quickly manifest itself. It'll be very easily detected that this individual is not in it to serve God, but rather he's in it to make a quick buck or to have a position of leadership over the people. So essentially, a marja is someone who qualifies as a scholar, as a learned scholar. Number two, he is also pious and he maintains the rules of this faith and of this religion. He gets to become a source of emulation, which is what a marja basically means. It is someone you refer back to as a source of emulation, someone you ask questions from and you find out what your religious obligation is, and so you follow them in your daily affairs.
Ahsan Sayyid. Very nice introduction on what a marja is. Sayyid, so now that you've explained what a marja is, how does one become a marja? Like, can any Tom, Dick or Harry just become a marja? Just, it's like, oh yeah, I just decided to be one and, just start getting people to follow you. And how do you become one?
So one thing I need to clarify to the dear audience, and this is probably something that maybe people don't look at it from this vantage point. And that is that unlike political institutions, and also unlike academic institutions, the marja'iyya isn't an institution. It's not an establishment. I think sometimes people make the mistake of calling it the religious establishment or the clerical establishment. But these terminologies, I think this is for a lack of a better term, right? There might be a malevolent intent when people use this expression, when they're trying to undermine the ulama and the marja'iyya by calling it religious establishment, as though it's a bunch of elites who get together at some place and there's black smoke that comes out the chimney and so forth. There's like secret meetings and whatnot. Or there could be a lack of knowledge about the way things work, which is why people say religious establishment. And this is kind of a term that's borrowed from perhaps the Catholic Church or maybe some other religious denominations out there. But in reality, what you have is a series of schools. You have classes where individuals rise the ranks of scholarship through a very rigorous and time-honored process. This isn't something that was invented yesterday. This has been going on for over 1,000 years. And they start by learning the basics, right? What we call al-muqaddimat, the introductory prerequisites to Islamic scholarship. Then they learn as-sutuh, which is the sort of intermediate level, where they basically study the same material except at different levels, right? They start by looking at things in a broader view, and then they kind of hone in and try and understand the nuances of every rule. Every syllable and every verse and every hadith is examined thoroughly and extensively. And so as people progress through this process, in time, they begin to establish their scholarly credentials. And so they learn, and they then start to impart that knowledge to other people. So they start out as students, then they teach others, and they do this for a good 20, 30, or 40 years, right? Until they reach a position where there is general consensus that this person is very qualified, and number two, has a very good grasp of juristic matters, right? Has a very good grasp of the Quran, the Hadith, and fiqh, and legal theory, which is basically the rules with which jurisprudence works, what we call usul al-fiqh, right? So that's the process in a nutshell. Again, it's something that might differ from time to time slightly. There might be different texts that the maraja have to study and teach and write in order to gain that recognition. But ultimately, it's about gaining the recognition of your peers, right? That's what it is. There's no sort of system out there. There have been attempts to create a system to make it more methodical and systematic, and have certificates and stamps and qualifications that you can hang on the wall and stuff like that. But for the most part, in our history, over 1,000 years, since Shaykh At-Tusi, radwanullah ta'ala alayh, who's largely credited as being Shaykh Al-Ta'ifa, and the one who sort of established the Hawza system, as we find it today, it's been pretty much the same.
So a couple of questions in regards to that. So, for example, you've got some maraja that became maraja at a very young age. We have the consensus that they got to teach for 30, 40 years, and then eventually they move into it. But what about those odd scholars that moved into it kind of at an early stage? Like, were they special cases where they excelled very quickly, or were they gifted with an ability where it's like this person's unique, this person's going to get to the top real quick? And on top of that, the second part is it something that needs to be approved by a living marja, or is it something that the individual himself just gets up and says that I'm at this point now?
So regarding the individuals that might reach this level early on as opposed to the norm, you're right. There are people who we've been told had such exceptional abilities, they were so unique in their intelligence and ability to extrapolate rulings from the original sources when they were extremely young. So Allam al-Hilli, for example, is a famous citation as someone who reached the level of ijtihad before he became baligh. So essentially, before he was required by Islam to abide by religious rules, he knew all of the religious rules, right? although I have to add the caveat that perhaps the definition of a faqih has slightly changed from then until now. That's not to say that Alam al-Halli was not a faqih, especially during those early years, but I think it might have been a little different. And there's a very important point that I have to mention there. The process is one where there's a culmination of knowledge, right? Let me clarify that. At the time of Sheikh al-Tusi, right, the number of ahadith, for example, weren't as the collection of hadiths that we had weren't as abundant as they are today, right? This has practical implications and it's very important, right? At the time of Sheikh al-Saduq, Sheikh al-Tusi, al-Kulayni, radwanullah ta'ala alayhim ajma'in, there might have been things that were discovered later and were incorporated into the canon or the hadith corpus of the Shia faith that weren't available back then. Or another example is usul al-fiqh. Usul al-fiqh, which is the legal framework in which jurisprudence operates, it's almost like the best way to describe usul al-fiqh would be to say it's the rules with which you have to extrapolate rulings. Extrapolation, the process of istinbat, has a set of meta rules that apply to it. These are broad ranging rules and laws that have to be applied and have to be understood fully before you can make the right call on so many different things, right? And there are examples which we might get to mention later on. And how your understanding of usul can change your fatwa, even though two maraja' might be looking at the exact same evidence, the same verse, the same hadith, but the conclusions they reach differ based on how they the framework with which they see those sources. But usul al-fiqh, during the time of, let's say, al-Sharif al-Murtada, right, might have been summarized in 12 pages. Whereas now usul al-fiqh has been expanded to such a degree where you would need years and years of studying usul al-fiqh. So, to become a faqih during that time might have required less check boxes, right? Less things to qualify for, less exams to sit, right? Not that there is an exam to sit, but ultimately the definition of the term might have differed. That's one point. What was the other question?
The question was if you need a marja' to give you that permission or
right.
permit that you become one.
That's a very good question, actually. So ultimately, what's required is widespread recognition of this individual's qualification as a faqih, right? Now, that widespread recognition can come in the form of another leading marja', an established marja' who might give you an actual certificate, or it might come through other means. Now, the rule is that you need a recognized marja', a peer, someone who himself is has established his credentials, right? For that person to give you some kind of certificate or what we call taqreed or ijazat ijtihad. Ijazat ijtihad is what gives permission to the next marja' to give his fatwa based on the approval of the previous marja', right? So this is the rule, and this has been how maraja' are selected and how maraja' are recognized for 1,000 years, right? There are very few cases, however, where a marja' doesn't have a risala or ijaza from his teacher, right? But he himself is so qualified that there is no question in the entire hawza and the entire seminary that this person is a mujtahid, right? So this has happened, but it's very rare, and it's also much more difficult. Because think about it, to become a doctor, you need a medical degree from a qualified university. Now, if you came without a medical degree, Imagine the hoops, imagine the level of trust that you need to build before every single doctor recognizes you as a marja. Whereas when you go to university, you don't need to convince every doctor, every physician that you're qualified. You just need to convince your teachers and the people who, for example, examine your PhD or supervise your PhD or what have you. Whereas if you want to convince every single physician out there that you're qualified as a doctor, it takes much more effort. That's why it's so much rare to see this happen.
Ahsan Sayyid. There is a little point that you mentioned, but we'll come back to it later on. I think it's a very, very important question. Moving forward, history of Maraja. So you've kind of touched up on it briefly, but where does it go back to? I mean, how long has it been around? Again, there is another question that touches up on it. But just to give a brief...
What's the other question? Let's try and...
The other question is, are there any narrations about needing to follow one?
Ahsant. I think we needed both questions together because the second question kind of answers the first one in terms of the timeline, right? So, a marja', while that's the title we give them today, they might have had different titles before, but essentially their task was the same, which was the ability to issue religious decrees. In other words, provide religious guidance to people, and for that religious guidance to be binding and valid, right? So, this concept has existed since the time of the Imams themselves. In other words, Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam would tell some of his companions whom he had trained, whom he had taught for years and years, and was so confident in their ability to extrapolate religious rulings that he would tell them to go to the masjid of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and to give fatwa, which is exactly what a marja' does. Like if you asked a person, even a lay person, what is the job description of a marja', they will say, to give a fatwa. And that's something the Imams told some of their companions to do. Now, remember, this is at the time of the Imams themselves, which tells you what? Which tells you that this as a concept, as an institution, for lack of a better word, is something that the Imams created. They didn't just validate it, they didn't just approve it, they created it. There was a need and the Imams filled that need. There was a void and the Imams filled that void, right? Remember, at the time of the Imams alayhimus salam, you had, on the one hand, the extreme restrictions that were placed on the Imams of the Ahlul Bayt, and we could talk about that until kingdom come. The pressures that the Imams were under, the fact that the Imams would be placed under house arrest, they would be exiled, Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam was in Medina, and yet suddenly we see the Imam emerge in Kufa, right? And spend 2 years there and then go back to Medina, and so on and so forth. Then when you come to the later Imams alayhimus salam, Imam al-Jawad, Muhammad ibn Ali al-Jawad, Imam Ali ibn Muhammad al-Hadi, and Imam al-Hasan al-Askari, the restrictions that were imposed on the Imams were just mind-boggling, right? They would be placed under house arrest. Imam al-Kadhim famously would be imprisoned for over a decade. So you had these restrictions on the one hand. On the other hand, you had a community of devotees and followers which was growing exponentially. The Shia at the time of Imam Zayn al-Abidin alayhi salam were just 4. When Imam al-Hussein was killed, there were just 4 households in Medina. Obviously, there were some in Kufa. There were pockets, right? There were little pockets scattered across the Muslim world. But by the time the 8th Imam, Ar-Ridha alayhi salatu wassalam, emerges, you have a massive following. And the Imam himself causes tashayyu' to spread like wildfire. And people who had no idea who the Ahlul Bayt were, people who had just heard of the family of the Prophet but never seen them, suddenly they were head over heels in love and they would become Shia. So how do you deal with the Imams being under house arrest and in exile and in prison and so on and so forth, with a community that's growing so rapidly? There is no way to deal with that except through the concept of wikala, right? And for the most part, those wukala were also fuqaha, right? It wasn't always the case. It wasn't always the case that they were the most knowledgeable. There might have been fuqaha who weren't appointed as wukala of the Imams necessarily, because wukala is something that is more akin to what we have today as marja'iyya. The marja' is a wakil in a sense / faqih. So he gives a fatwa, he gives you religious guidance, he tells you what you're supposed to do when it comes to your acts of worship, to your contracts, to even bigger issues. But he's also a wakil in the sense that there is financial transactions, he takes your alms, he spends it where it's supposed to be spent, and so on and so forth. So it's a hybrid system between the two. But essentially, it started with the approval of the Imams alayhimus salam because there was a gap that needed to be filled. And it was almost like a precursor to the later years when the Imams knew that there would be a time when the 12th Imam would go into occultation and the Shia would turn into people who have no leadership, right? So that leadership vacuum had to be filled, and the Imams did so and planned to do so early on.
Ahsan Sayyid. So the question that immediately comes after what you've just said, which is the next question, is it obligatory to follow one? Like, do I have to follow a marja, or can I go with the concept of, you hear this a lot, I just follow the Quran and Ahlul Bayt, and yeah, it's just straight cut for me, you know. I don't need someone to come and tell me what to do. He's got brains, I got brains, but the Prophet left behind two things, and I'm sweet, you know. Thanks for the note. So, is it obligatory to follow one?
Simple answer to that question is no, it's not. You don't have to follow a marja. But you'd have to be a marja yourself. So that's kind of a bummer, I know. Maybe not the answer most people were looking for. But again, we'd have to go back to the role that a marja plays. A marja essentially gives you a shortcut. He does the hard work for you. A marja does what a doctor, what a physician does, right? It's a logical concept. It doesn't even require religious scripture to establish this as something that's required. Anyone who's in need in an area where they lack knowledge, they refer to who? They refer to the experts. Yeah. A marja is merely an expert. Well, merely, is not the right word. But ultimately, he's an expert in the sphere of religion, right? Which is a very dense, very sophisticated, very complicated area that encompasses, according to some of our ulama, to become a mujtahid, and this probably goes back to the early questions that you asked. To become a mujtahid, to become a marja, is at least, the amount of work that's required is at least equivalent to about 5 PhDs, right? So the amount of work that's required, and the reason they say 5 is because you're becoming an expert in more than one field. It's like having a PhD in microbiology as well as cosmology and astronomy. I mean, these are fields that are not exactly overlapping or intersecting. They're two distinct fields, but you have to become the foremost expert in not just 2, but 5 or 6 different fields before you can actually take the position of marja'iyya. So, do you have to follow one? No, but it's in your interest to do so. The easy thing to do is to simply refer to a physician if you're sick, to go to a neurosurgeon if there is a lump that's pushing against your skull, God forbid. The best, most logical thing to do is to consult your neurosurgeon. The hard thing to do is to say, okay, I'm going to go and become a neurosurgeon. I'm going to go to medical school and study for the next 15 years.
Well, then you would have dropped dead.
By then you're dead. And that's literally our problem with people who say we don't need maraja. Because right now you need the guidance of maraja to tell you how you're supposed to pray, how you're supposed to... Just the shukuk in salat, right? What shak invalidates your salah? What doubt, that is, invalidates the salah? And what doubt does not invalidate the salah? There are certain doubts that should never impede your salah. You should never break your salah because of them. But there are doubts that you're supposed to do that. Or I'll give you a simple example. We all know that one of the conditions of prayer being valid is that makan al-musalli has to be halal. Right? So the place that you pray, if it's been usurped, if it's ghasb, if it's been taken by force or coercion or stolen or anything like that, then your salah is not valid. You could do salah Ja'far al-Tayyar that goes on for 2 hours, but if the place you're praying on is not, if the owner doesn't allow you to pray there, it's haram. So here's a question. You're in a place that is ghasb, or the owner doesn't allow you, expressly told you that you're not supposed to pray here. Right? Let's say it's a giant field, 100 acres size. You're there, suddenly you realize you haven't prayed. And salah is becoming qada in 15 minutes time. It takes you longer to get out of that field, that land,
to make the prayer.
make the prayer, right? So, which is now more important? Salah being done in time or salah being done in a place that's halal? What do? If you say, I'm going to go become a mujtahid before I figure out the answer to this, forget about your salah, your life's expired, right? My point is, this is a very rigorous process. If people understand, I'll give you one example, right?
We're going to have to get that answer before we move on.
Which answer?
The answer to that question.
I mean, my point is, do you have to follow a marja'? The answer is, unless you are a marja' yourself, then absolutely.
Yeah.
You have to do it. There's no way around it because you need an expert. The Holy Prophet ﷺ says in a famous hadith, إِنَّ هَذَا الدِّينَ مَتِينٌ فَأَوْغِلُوهُ بِرِفْقٍ. This religion is dense. It's complex. There are things about this religion that require much deliberation, much scholarly pursuit, hard work for years and years and years, right? So you either become an expert, and the Quran gives us the solution. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Holy Quran, فَلَوْلَا نَفَرَ مِنْ كُلِّ فِرْقَةٍ مِّنْهُمْ طَائِفَةٌ لِيَتَفَقَّهُوا فِي الدِّينِ وَمَا كَانَ لِلنَّاسِ, at the beginning of the verse, it says, لِيَنْفِرُوا كَافَّةً, right? All people can't go to become mujtahids. We can't expect everyone to become a marja', right? Because then you wouldn't have any bakeries, you wouldn't have any taxi drivers, you wouldn't have any doctors, you wouldn't have anything else, right? Except maraja', 300 million of them. Allah bless them. So that's not a realistic expectation. So what does the Quran tell us to do? It's right there. فَلَوْلَا نَفَرَ مِنْ كُلِّ فِرْقَةٍ. Then, as an alternative, then from every community, a group should go out. Nafr, which is to travel, to go, to put in the hard work. You can't expect to become a mujtahid by reading a few books. You have to go, you have to learn from the ulama themselves, right? لا يحوز العلم إلا من يطيل درسه, the hadith says. To take a long time studying, يطيل, right? And the Quran then says, ليتفقهوا في الدين وَلِيُنذِرُوا قَوْمَهُمْ إِذَا رَجَعُوا إِلَيْهِمْ لَعَلَّهُمْ يَحْذَرُونَ. To become fuqaha, then to come back and preach to their people.
Ahsan Sayyid. Sayyid, when Imam al-Zaman, Ajjallahu Ta'ala Faraj al-Sharif, he had the major occultation and the minor occultation. He had Fauna Webb, which were the 4 people that pretty much gave out the knowledge to the people and whatnot, while the Imam was in his minor occultation. And then as soon as they passed, he went into his major. Can you discuss slightly the duty of these 4 and who the 4 were?
Ahsant. So the 4 emissaries or deputies or ambassadors of the Imam, what we call the sufara of the Imam, they were the ambassadors. These were individuals that were handpicked by not just the Imam of the time, but the first emissary was Uthman ibn Sa'id al-Amri, who was appointed by Imam al-Hadi alayhi. He was a companion of Imam al-Hadi. Imam al-Hasan al-Askari also used him as a deputy, as a wakil. And when it was time for the lesser occultation to begin, the first ambassador, the first emissary was Uthman ibn Sa'id al-Amri, who was also given the title, by the way, as-Zayyat or as-Samman. Do you know why that is? Samn or Zayt is cooking oil. His job was selling cooking oil. And as part of his job, he would deliver the oil to homes, and he would bring them in like barrels or buckets or what have you. He would hand deliver them to the buyer. And he used that to go to people's homes and to meet with the prominent members of the community and to deliver messages of the Imam alayhi salam. So that is in itself like it's a mind-blowing concept that the first emissary of the Imam of the time, Uthman ibn Sa'id al-Amri, would be an oil merchant. Which tells you that, all of us, irrespective of our occupations, we can lead good, honest lives, and we could reach positions of proximity to the Imam alayhi salam, regardless of where you are. You don't need to become a faqih to be close to the Imam and to be one of the people that the Imam obviously we'll never be emissaries or deputies or ambassadors to the Imam, but we can be close Shia and followers, right? So Uthman ibn Sa'id al-Amri became the first emissary. He was the representative of the Imam or the Na'ib al-Khas, I believe, for about 5 years or so. And then his son became the successor, the second emissary, right? Muhammad ibn Uthman al-Amri. Now these two, remember I mentioned that the previous Imams had spoken of their virtue and of their stature and whatnot. There is quite a number of traditions that talk about how the Imams entrusted them, to such an extent that one hadith says, Al-Amriyan thiqatan, فما يؤديان عني يؤديان وما يقولان فعني يقولان. Right? I believe Imam al-Hasan al-Askari alayhi salam said that. He said in reference to both the father and the son, Uthman ibn Sa'id and Muhammad ibn Uthman, that these two are reliable, they're trustworthy, I trust them. The second part is even more amazing. The Imam says, so whatever they deliver from me. And whatever they say, quoting me. وَمَا يَقُولَانْ فَعَنِّي يَقُولَانْ, which is amazing. And there is a debate as to whether or not this actually is an all-encompassing statement. Is it exhaustive? For example, does everything they say a message from the Imam? Or is it only the things they quote the Imam? But whatever it is, their reliability, their trustworthiness was absolutely incredible. Which tells you why the Imams chose them. Piety, knowledge, all those things aside, as messengers, as people who could take the position of ambassadorship to the Imams, they were top of their fields. Then the third person, and by the way, Muhammad ibn Uthman al-Amri, the second emissary, was the ambassador or the deputy of the Imam for 40 years. 40, which also gave him incredible influence during that extremely difficult era of the lesser occultation. And as a testament to his management skills and his ability to carry out the tasks as best as he could, we're told that at one point in the city of Baghdad alone, he himself had 10 deputies. Wow. So he was a master deputy who had his own network of deputies. And those deputies then carried out the task of delivering messages, collecting khums and huquq, and so on and so forth. Then the third emissary was Al-Husayn ibn Ruh. Al-Husayn ibn Ruh al-Nawbakhti was also very close to Muhammad ibn Uthman. In fact, an interesting point that I think our audience might not have heard before is that, and again, it's a testament to the piety of these individuals. Muhammad ibn Uthman, when he was on his deathbed, remember, 40 years of being known as the ambassador to Imam al-Zaman, the only gate, the only doorway to the Imam. One of the things he did as part of his duties was also train scholars and ulama and fuqaha and so forth. There was one individual by the name of Ja'far who was seen as the closest confidant to Muhammad ibn Uthman al-Amri. And everyone assumed that he would be the third ambassador because of his closeness to his teacher, because they say his teacher wouldn't even eat a meal without him present. So as far as Muhammad ibn Uthman al-Amri was concerned, perhaps even he might have assumed that it would be him, because he was very knowledgeable, this Ja'far, very close to him, spent a lot of time with him. He was with him 24/7, essentially. So it is said that at the time of his death, Muhammad ibn Uthman ibn Sa'id al-Amri, he was on his deathbed. He had a very high fever. And so Ja'far, this person, was sitting by his head, holding his head, placing the wet cloth over the forehead and just looking after his personal affairs, right? While Al-Husayn ibn Ruh al-Nawbakhti was sitting by the feet. And there might have been other people as well, I'm sure. And so someone approached and said to Muhammad ibn Uthman, he said to him, if God forbid something happened to you, then who would be your successor? Who would take lead after you? So he said, I have been commanded to appoint Al-Husayn ibn Ruh. To everyone's shock. Now, Ja'far, who everybody assumed that he would be the successor, immediately got up and he told Husayn ibn Ruh, this is your position. You come and sit by the head. Which again tells you how pious they were. He did not even hesitate. He didn't even say, but what about me? Is there, perhaps, could you reconsider? Like the early hypocrites who said, Inna rajul la yahjur, he's just being delirious, he doesn't know what he's talking about, like they did to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Absolute submission and devotion, resigned to the will of his master, the Imam of the time. The Imam chose him. In fact, at some point they even asked Ja'far, the people, they said, we all expected you to become the successor. What happened? He said, look, the Imam appoints the successor, not me, not Muhammad ibn Uthman. And also, Al-Husayn ibn Ruh has such an incredible ability to keep secrets that he puts all of us to shame. In other words, he praised the actual successor of the Imam, and he said that if he was hiding the Imam somewhere, and they came and they used nail clippers to cut him piece by piece, death by 1,000 wounds, as they say, right? If they did that to Husayn ibn Ruh, he would never disclose the location of the Imam. In other words, his knowledge, his piety, his ability to manage the affairs of the believers is superior to me, right? And finally, the last emissary of the Imam was Ali ibn Muhammad al-Samari. And Ali ibn Muhammad al-Samari was the ambassador for only about 3 years, right? So it was basically a transitional period. 5 years, 40 years, about 15 years Husayn ibn Ruh, I think, or 13 years or so, and then 3 years with Ali ibn Muhammad al-Samari. And towards the end of his life, 6 days to be exact before he died, he received a message from the Imam. And the message said, إن بينك وبين الموت ستة أيام. There are 6 days between you and your death. So get your affairs in order. Do what you're supposed to do. If there are letters, if there are any loose ends, if there are any funds that need to be given to whoever they're supposed to be given and so on, do all of that because you only have 6 days left. وَلَا تَنصِبْ أَحَدًا بَعْدَكَ. Do not appoint anyone after you because God's command has been fulfilled and this is the beginning of a new era, the era of the greater occultation.
Ahsan Sayyid.
Sallallahu alayhi.
Sayyid, a question that arises, how do I know who to follow? I mean, there's so many maraja out there. And another question that I wanted to tie into that was, once I do know who to follow, once that marja passes away, can I still follow that marja? Like, can we follow a marja that has passed?
Who do you follow sort of ties in with our earlier discussions about qualification. At the end of the day, if you were to fix a plumbing issue in your kitchen, you would get someone who's qualified. You'd get a plumber who's recognized by the trade group or the, whatever society they have.
You got a plumbing license.
You need a plumbing license, right? When it comes to marja'iyya, unfortunately, there is this tendency that ignorant people within the community, and they've been around for a long time, to feel or to sort of be deceived by some appearances. And one thing I have to say here is that as long as we have real monetary tender, real money, we're going to have counterfeit money. And as long as we have real belief, we will have counterfeit belief in the form of hypocrisy. As long as we have real fuqaha and maraja and sources of emulation, we're going to inevitably have counterfeit maraja. People who claim to have knowledge, who claim to have the qualifications, and they might even have a lot of money, they might even have access to the media, they might have, massive social media groups or whatever. I'm sure there are going to be people, I mean, right now in Iraq, we have a bunch of people who are, they're recognized as former Ba'ath Party members, right? And yet, after the fall of the regime, they came and they slapped on a turban and paid large sums of money, created a network of deputies around the country, and started getting more and more people to literally driven to their headquarters to create a big audience so it could all be filmed and broadcast, and they claim to be maraja, right? And of course, they've been called out, right? They've been called out on the smallest, pettiest things, like their inability to speak Arabic properly, or their inability to read the Quran properly, and so on and so forth. But then every once in a while, you come across a real good, well-crafted counterfeit currency. Every once in a while, you come across someone who gets all the basics right and claims to be the marja. And so, in the midst of this, given the confusion that might arise every once in a while, what do? The answer is, you go with the one who is the safest, right? You go with the one who has the largest consensus. For example, no one will ever dispute that Sheikh Wahid Khurasani, may Allah bless him and give him a long life, is a qualified faqih of the highest caliber. No one will dispute that Sayyid Sistani is a qualified faqih and a marja, right? No one will dispute these kinds of individuals. You have a few in Qom, you have a few in Najaf, you have a few in other countries, in Karbala, elsewhere. You might have a few in Mashhad. At the end of the day, these are people who enjoy such a wide consensus that there is little to zero chance of them turning out to be counterfeits, right? If you go to the fringes, if you go to individuals whose qualifications are questionable as far as that widespread recognition, that doesn't mean that there are not mujtahids, right? Automatically, but what it does mean is that you then have to take the onus on your shoulder to evaluate them and to figure out whether they're real maraja or not, whether they actually fit the bill, which makes your job harder. For the most part, to answer the question, I guess briefly, they say that to know who to follow or to identify the most qualified marja, you need to refer to the experts, right? You need at least the testimony of 2 qualified experts. Now, who are these qualified experts? They are the people next in line to marja'iyah. In other words, they're the people who teach Dars al-Kharij, right? They are teaching the highest level of juristic studies in the Hawza. They have a big enough following. They themselves are qualified as being, because to be a teacher of Dars al-Kharij is not very difficult to ascertain, right? You see them, right? If you go to Masjid A'zam in the holy city of Qom, you see a Dars, Sheikh Wahid Khurasani, for example, about 2,000 people studying under him. So it's pretty easy to ascertain that this person is an expert. But ultimately, you need the testimony of experts. And that's one of the beauties of our faith, Haj Ali, in that in our faith, in the school of the Ahlul Bayt, the onus is left to the individual to make that determination, right? Because these maraja don't have fancy schmancy, certificates hanging on the wall, right? Then you have to do some homework. You have to consult the experts. And the experts, as I said, they're not just any sheikh or any person who leads a community. It has to be qualified people who understand fiqh, who understand usul, who understand the Quran at an expert level, who then can provide that guidance or advisory.
The second half of that question, Sayyid, and then inshallah we got, I think, 2 questions left. Can you follow a marja that has passed?
So it depends. Generally speaking, they say that one of the conditions of a marja, at least as far as the usuli school, contemporary ulama, I think there is consensus who say that you have to, one of the conditions of a marja is for him to be baligh, for him to be of sound birth, meaning he's of legitimate birth, to be male, and to be alive. Right? These are some of the basic requirements that Maraja discuss. There might be some differences of opinion about some of these things at some point, especially in what we call al-bahth al-sana'i, which is when the marja is actually sitting down debating with his students and expressing his views about these things. There might be some different opinions that he expresses, but the fatwa of the maraja is, for the most part, that the marja has to be alive, which means that if I wanted to choose a marja for myself now for the first time, that marja has to be alive. Now, whether you can then continue to follow the marja that you've already been following after he's passed away, it depends on the fatwa of the living marja. So the living maraja, if they tell you that you can follow the marja that you've been following, if they give you that ijazah, then you can continue to do so. So you need, for that fatwa to be valid, for your taqleed to continue to be valid, you need another marja to validate it for you, right? In other words, you need an expert who is alive, who says, you know what, you can continue to follow this marja.
Ahsan, Sayyid. Thanks for the clarification. Sayyid, one of the known criteria, as we know, mentions to follow the most learned, or this is something that used to be around. However, each and every marja excels others in certain aspects. So how is this clarified, or is it just not something that needs to be looked into anymore?
So let me take a step back actually and go to the discussion on what the Imams of the Ahlul Bayt have said about this. Because remember, we said that it's a logical thing for a layperson to follow an expert. Hence, it's logical for us to follow maraja. However, logic aside, what does the actual scripture say about this? What do the Imams say about this? And in that regard, we have a number of hadiths that are often cited as evidence for marja'iyya, and additionally, as criteria that must be met by a person to be taken as a source of emulation, right? Remember, we call a marja' what? Marja' Taqleed.
Taqleed, yeah.
Right? What does taqleed mean? In English, we say emulation, right? It's when you imitate someone, when you emulate someone. They go this way, you go the same way. However, another meaning of taqleed is tuqalliduhu dinak, which means that you place the onus of the validity of your actions around his neck. In other words, on the day of judgment, if God said to me, why did you do this? I'll just say, God, subhanaka ya ilahi wa ta'alayt, but I followed this person who, for all intents and purposes, was established as someone who was an expert in religion and who could give me the best possible answer. Could he have gone wrong? Sure. But he was the best we got, right? In the absence of our Imam, he's the best we have. Does that mean there's going to be disagreements between the Maraja'? Yes. And the disagreements, while some people will take the route of saying the disagreements are actually a blessing in disguise, it's good to have disagreements, I'll take a different route. The fact that we have differences of opinion between the Maraja' should act as a sobering and sad reminder of the fact that our Imam is in occultation. Hence, pray for the reappearance of the Imam. Hence, let's plead with God for our Imam to come back so we would not have any disagreements like this over every petty little thing, right? The moon sighting and so on and so forth. The moon sighting, I should say, because that's like the most common thing. At the end of the day, there's going to be disagreements because not everybody's right. Someone might have got it right, someone got it wrong, right? But it's the best we have. And so the Imams have given us criteria to look for in a marja'. I want to share a very important text actually with you, if I may, which is often referred to as Maqboolat Umar ibn Hanzala or Sahihat Umar ibn Hanzala, depending on your the school that you follow in authenticating the chains of narration, right? It's a hadith that's referenced by Maraja' when they discuss the conditions of a faqih, the conditions of a marja', a source of emulation. Umar ibn Hanzala was a companion of Imam As-Sadiq alayhi salam, or someone who met the Imam, a Shia, and Al-Kafi Al-Kulayni, Muhammad ibn Yaqub Al-Kulayni radwanullah ta'ala alayhi, mentions this hadith, so it's in one of the four main collections of hadith, and it's called Maqboola because it's accepted as valid. No one disputes the authenticity of this. So what happens here essentially is Umar ibn Hanzala goes to Imam As-Sadiq alayhi salam. He says to him, Ya ibn Rasulullah, if there is a dispute between two of your followers, two of your Shia, remember this is when the Imam was living through the final days of the Umayyad dynasty and the early days of the Abbasid dynasty. You have tyrants, you have all these oppressive rulers. If there is a dispute between two Shia, can they consult the government's mufti, the government appointed mufti? Can they go to the courts to resolve this dispute? Or is there another mechanism? Now this has a lot of practical implications. So the Imam says to him the following. I'll read the actual Arabic hadith and then I'll translate. سألت أبا عبد الله عن رجلين من أصحابنا بينهما منازعة. Two of our ashab, meaning two of our jama'atna as we say, Shia, who have a dispute. في دين أو ميراث. Whether it be in a matter that has to do with a loan, a debt, or an inheritance. In other words, disputes that happen between us all the time. If this happens, فَتَحَاكَمَا إِلَى السُّلْطَانِ أَوْ إِلَى الْقُضَاةِ. To resolve this dispute, they either go to the government of the time, or they go to the judges who were essentially muftis appointed by the government. وَمَا يَحْكُمْ لَهُ فتحاكم إلى السلطان أو إلى القضاة أيحل ذلك? Is this permissible? Is this acceptable for them to resolve their... In other words, is the opinion of the judge that's appointed by the government there, is that binding? Is that religiously acceptable? If the judge says, no, the inheritance goes to this, not to that, for example, is that a way to resolve that dispute? The Imam said to him, من تحاكم إليهم في حق أو باطل. Whoever seeks their judgment and their verdict, whether it be in matters of truth or in matters of falsehood. In other words, you are on the truth or you're with falsehood. It doesn't matter. If you go to them, this is what happens. فإنما تحاكم إلى الطاغوت. You have referred to the tyrants. إلى الطاغوت. وما يحكم له فإنما يؤخذ سحتا. And if this judge tells you that you can take this money, even though it's yours to take, even if it's your haqq, if you go there and the judge tells you to take it, that money is haram, because you acquired it through the verdict of these judges. وإن كان حقا ثابتا له, even if it's actually yours, right? لأنه أخذه بحكم الطاغوت, because he took it by the verdict of the tyrant. وقد أمر الله أن يكفر به أو أن يكفر به. God has said not to validate or accept the verdict of the tyrants. The Imam mentions a verse then, يريدون أن يتحاكموا إلى الطاغوت وقد أمروا أن يكفروا به. قلت. Now this is the part that's relevant. Umar ibn Hanzala says to the Imam, فكيف يصنعان? What are they supposed to do then? If we can't go to the courts, how do we resolve these disputes? The Imam said, قال ينظران إلى. They should look for these qualifications. من كان منكم. He has to be one of you, number one. Has to be a follower of the Ahlul Bayt. Number two, ممن قد روى حديثنا. Narrates our traditions. In other words, narrates our traditions doesn't necessarily mean that all he does is narrate the traditions of the Ahlul Bayt like a parrot. It means he is someone who bases his views and opinions on the hadith of the Ahlul Bayt. يروى حديثنا ونظر في حلالنا وحرامنا. And he spends time looking at the haram and halal as per the opinion of the Ahlul Bayt, right? وَنَظَرَ فِي حَلَالِنَا وَحَرَامِنَا. Nazara you could also deduce from this the amount of time that needs to be spent on this, right? You have to, which is another discussion in and of itself. The idea of مُجْتَهِد مُتَجَزِّئ. The idea that maybe I can become an expert in moon sighting. Can I be an expert in moon sighting alone? Just do all the research that needs to be done and not have to refer to a marja? The overwhelming, or at least there is a suggestion that that's not possible. Because for you to be an expert in one area requires you to have a good grasp of the entirety of fiqh. You need to have a good understanding of the tone of the Imams, the way the Imams speak, how they address certain things, right? Which requires lengthy studies. Moving on. The Imam then says, وَعَرَفَ أَحْكَامَنَا. He knows our rulings. فَلْيَرْضُوا بِهِ حَكَمًا. Then, if this person is found and he qualifies, then you should consult his verdict. Listen to the rest. فَلْيَرْضُوا بِهِ حَكَمًا فَإِنِّي قَدْ جَعَلْتُهُ عَلَيْكُمْ حَاكِمًا. For sure I have appointed him as your judge. The Imam says, I've appointed him. Not directly, the Imam is given qualifications. If he fits it, the Imam says, you have to follow what he says. Right? Hakim actually means ruler. It's more than a judge. Hakiman. فَإِذَا حَكَمَ بِحُكْمِنَا. And if he gives a verdict based on our rulings. فَلَمْ يَقْبَلْهُ مِنْهُ. And they reject it, they don't accept it. And this, I think, kind of, we pivot into the discussion about whether people can reject a fatwa by a marja, right? The Imam explains here. The Imam says that if he gives you that verdict and you reject it, فَإِنَّمَا اسْتَخَفَّ بِحُكْمِ اللَّهِ. Then whoever does so is making a mockery of the ruling of God. In other words, what he says is God's ruling. You can't reject it. استخف بحكم الله وعلينا رد. And he has rejected us, not just this faqih. والراد علينا الراد على الله. And whoever rejects us, rejects Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وهو على حد الشرك بالله. And that is tantamount to attributing partners to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
SubhanAllah. That's amazing. Inshallah, if you can send that, and then we'll post it
Good.
onto the
Inshallah.
onto the page for people to refer to. Sayyid, we had one more question, but I think we'll cut it short because I think you wanted to just give a quick
Sure.
maybe 5 minutes or so about the birth of Imam al-Hadi.
Alayhi
So
salatu wassalam.
we know we started off viewers with the condolences and what's happening in Lebanon. However, we kind of go by the traditions of Ahlul Bayt, where we're sad on their occasions and we're happy on their occasions. So we do acknowledge the sad time and the condolences that we gave at the start of the show for what's happened in Lebanon. But at the same time, inshallah, the Sayyid will give several minutes just on the joyous occasion of the birth of Imam al-Hadi alayhi salam.
Inshallah.
Tfaddal, Sayyid.
Habibis, so you don't want to ask the
The
last
final question we'll
All right.
we'll skip it because I think it's
Inshallah.
I think we've clocked our time a bit.
Not a problem. One thing I will add before we go into the last segment is that I think one of the issues that a lot of people have, especially in this day and age, and in particular in the Western world, but also in Muslim majority countries, is this whole idea of the differences between maraja and how to reconcile between them. And there are some practical scenarios where this presents real challenges. Picture, for example, husband and wife, each of them following a different marja, and what happens on the day of Eid, for example, right? Or not just Eid, but like even the subtle nuances of religious rulings between parents, children, husband, wife, and even within the community. We've seen how people often look at this and see these differences and feel that there must be some way to reconcile and to sort of create more harmony. And the first thing I will say about that very briefly is that I don't think it's such a huge problem as people make it out to be. Yes, there could be some challenges. Eid is twice a year, so it's not such a big deal. And let's not make such a big deal out of it. At the end of the day, it's not a matter of choosing one marja and then everybody being happy about it. It's a matter of you exhausting the avenues to finding who your marja should be. And if the wife does that and reaches a different conclusion, and the husband does it and reaches another conclusion, then so be it, right? It's like saying both husband and wife need to go to the same school, consult the same doctors, and have everything the same. Obviously, that's not the case. They have differences of opinions, different tastes in everything. So when it comes to maraja, it's about you making sure you've exhausted those means of reaching your marja, right? And if that means you follow a different marja than your husband, then tough luck. So be it. That's point number one. Point number two, also very briefly, is that maraja do allow for some flexibility in certain areas. In fact, Sayyid Sistani and other maraja believe in a concept called tab'id khas, or they might call it different things, but essentially what it is if the marja hasn't reached a definitive, conclusive answer or opinion on certain things, then they allow you to follow the next marja, right? And this happens across the board. In fact, there are maraja who expand that concept and say, for example, in the rulings of Hajj, you can follow any marja that you want, as long as they tick all the main boxes, right? As Imam al-Hasan al-Askari alayhi salam, actually on the subject of taqleed, we should definitely mention this hadith because it's such an important hallmark of this entire discussion. Imam al-Hasan al-Askari famously says, "Man kana min al-fuqaha sa'inan li nafsih." The Imam says that if a person is a faqih, meaning that they have reached the level where they understand all the rulings and they can extrapolate them from the Quran and Hadith and ijma' and aql and so forth, then on top of that, they have to have piety, muti'an li amri mawlah, They also obey their masters. In other words, they're pious. They're not looking for fame. They're not looking for money. They're not looking for authority. They're actually trying to serve the imam of their time, which is another interesting point, is that unlike the Sunni tradition, if the mufti does something wrong that the government is not pleased with, they're simply replaced by someone else. In the Shi'i world, because the onus is on the Shia to pick the right marja', they have to be vigilant. They have to watch for any signs that, God forbid, if this marja' turns into a money hungry monster all of a sudden, which has happened in history. Ali ibn Abi Hamza al-Bata'ani was a wakil and a faqih during the time of Imam al-Kadhim alayhi salam. When you realize that this person is no longer the person that he used to be, just because he had a good, glorious past doesn't mean that he will continue on this path forever. If you find reason to suspect that this person is no longer qualified, you ditch them. That's it. It's not a government position that the ruler gets to remove them or put them in place. You simply don't follow them. That's how it works. So there are maraja' who say that you can actually follow other maraja' in areas where it's difficult to reconcile, right? And so there are people who believe in tab'id mutlaq. And tab'id mutlaq is where you can basically pick and choose between the qualified, pious, learned maraja' who tick all those boxes, and you can't quite tell who's the most knowledgeable. You can't really, how do you tell apart, let's say, I don't know, Sheikh Al-Fayyad, may Allah bless him, for example, and Sheikh, let's say, Bashir al-Najafi. Right? May Allah bless him as well. These are maraja' who are highly qualified, but then telling them apart to actually make that distinction is very difficult. So there are maraja' today who do allow you to pick and choose between these maraja', as long as you're not doing so out of your own personal desire and expediency. Meaning that you're not doing it just for fun. You're not doing it just because, this marja' allows this, so let's just go ahead and do it. But rather, it's to make life easier and create more harmony in the family and in the community. Now, as you said, it's important to acknowledge the joyous festivities of the Ahlul Bayt, because you rightly pointed out the Imams as having said, Shi'atuna yafrahuna li farahina wa yahzanuna li huznina. And so tonight marks the birth anniversary of Imam Ali al-Hadi alayhi salatu wassalam. And just in a few minutes, I'd like to say a few words about the Imam and his life. Subhanallah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sent 3 prophets who were children, Yahya, Isa, and Sulaiman, and 3 Imams who were also quote-unquote children. Obviously, they can't be called children because their knowledge, the position of imamah is something that exceeds. It's age is irrelevant, right? And these 3 Imams were Imam al-Jawad alayhi salam, Imam al-Hadi, and our 12th Imam al-Hujjah ibn al-Hasan al-Askari, ajjalallahu ta'ala farajahu al-sharif. Imam al-Hadi became an Imam at the age of 7. And what the Khalifa at the time, who was Al-Ma'mun, the Khalifa at the time was Mutawakkil. And he realized that Al-Ma'mun made a big mistake with Imam al-Jawad alayhi salam. When Imam al-Jawad, when Imam al-Ridha was murdered by Ma'mun, Ma'mun tried to endear Imam al-Jawad to him. And in an effort not to expose his murderous personality and the fact that he was behind the assassination of Imam al-Ridha, he brought Imam al-Jawad close to him. He said, I'd like you to marry my daughter. And indeed, he did marry him, his daughter, al-Fadl, la'natullah alayha, who eventually killed Imam al-Jawad, poisoned him to death because she was outcast by her uncle. And her uncle said that if she came begging him to let her live in the palace, the Khalifa, who was her uncle, said to her that if you want to go back, the only way you can do it is if you poison your husband. But Ma'mun tried to endear Imam al-Jawad and bring him close to him and so forth. But that backfired. And the reason it backfired is because people recognized Imam al-Jawad, and they recognized, see, Ma'mun made a miscalculation thinking that Imam al-Jawad, being this young boy, surely he's not going to be able to fulfill the duties of an imam. So he's going to expose himself. He won't be able to convince people of his divine authority. And so he sort of put him on a platform, allowed people to come and see him, speak to him. He organized debates between him and the highest ranking scholars, but it backfired in a really, really bad way for Ma'mun, because Imam al-Jawad alayhi salam only became more and more famous as the indisputable vicegerent of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the miracles, the debates, and so on and so forth. So by the time Imam al-Hadi alayhi salam became the Imam, the successor of his father, they realized, Mutawakkil in particular, that he shouldn't do this. So what he did was, he made an announcement saying that Ali al-Hadi is he's not going to make any public appearances. Instead, he's going to go into hiding. Basically, he will lead a private life under the supervision of teachers. We're going to appoint teachers for him to help him grow and become a scholar like his predecessors. And so they came, and there was this one incident where they came to Baghdad and made an announcement. The governor made an announcement saying, we want someone who can come and supervise this young boy, right? So they picked the most hateful Nasibi at the time, and they told him that you should be his teacher. In other words, they wanted this person to brainwash the Imam, to break the cycle, right? So they came, appointed this Nasibi. After a while, the governor saw the teacher, and he said to him, what's happening with the Fata, with this young boy that you're teaching? He said, Fata? I am his Fata. I am the boy and he's the teacher. He's the master, I'm the slave. Who have you given me? What do you think you're doing here? You gave me this young boy. He's more knowledgeable than anyone I've ever seen in my life. And so news began to spread that Imam al-Hadi alayhi salam was just as miraculous, just as learned, just as pious as all of his predecessors, his ancestors, the Imams of the Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam, to the point that the governor of Hijaz, at one point, they exiled Imam al-Hadi to Medina. So a governor of Hijaz sent a letter to Mutawakkil saying, listen, if you want Hijaz to continue as part of your domain, you need to get rid of Ali al-Hadi. Send him back to you, to Samarra, right? Do not keep him here, because here everybody's gravitating towards him. So Mutawakkil said, you know what? Send him to me, but don't make it look like he's being exiled, because he was trying to put up a show. So he said, we're going to send 400 soldiers or 300 soldiers or so, and they will be for his protection. So they will come and they will take him through Medina and then Hijaz, through Iraq, all the way to Samarra. So every city that Imam al-Jawad went to had an uproar, because everybody flocked to the caravan of Imam al-Jawad. News of the Imam's knowledge had spread. The fact that he was only, in his less than 10 years old, and yet despite that was so knowledgeable, just made everybody's jaw drop. And so when he reached Baghdad, the governor sent a letter to Mutawakkil saying, listen, we arrived in Baghdad late in the day, right? And yet the entire city of Baghdad is now surrounding the place where the Imam is staying, because they all want to have an audience with him. I don't know what to do with this. He's going to turn Baghdad over to another Alawi city. So Mutawakkil said, you know what, don't wait until tomorrow. Have him sent to me tonight. Imam al-Hadi goes to Samarra. And in that time in Samarra, subhanallah, at one point, I'll just mention this story. Mutawakkil sent someone to the house where the Imam, when he first went there, Mutawakkil said to him, I have a nice, comfortable house ready for you. He said, no, I will buy my own house. The Imams of the Ahlul Bayt, since the time of Ibrahim alayhi salam, they would buy their houses, they would buy the place where they're buried, which is why the shrine of Askariyin in Samarra is the personal property of Imam al-Hadi alayhi salam. The personal property of Imam al-Zaman as the heir to Imam al-Hadi and Imam al-Askari, right? It doesn't belong to any awqaf, it doesn't belong to anyone. It's the personal property. So he bought 2 houses, combined them together, and they became his final resting place. So Mutawakkil sent someone to the house of the Imam to search through it to find out if there is anything that's, any money or weapons or whatever. So he goes to the house, and sure enough, he finds 10,000 dirhams, which is a lot of money. So they told the Imam, where did this money come from? The Imam said, tell Mutawakkil, your mother sent me this. Because Mutawakkil fell sick, and his sickness wouldn't go away, the fever wouldn't go away. So his mother made a vow, a nadhr, that if he got well, I would give 10,000 dirhams to Ali ibn Muhammad al-Hadi alayhi salam. Mutawakkil got well, she sent the money to the Imam. In other words, Imam al-Hadi won the admiration of the mother of Mutawakkil. Not just his mother, but his son. Listen to this. One day, Mutawakkil is sitting in a garden rose garden, full of beautiful roses and flowers and whatnot. The tree he was sitting under was yellow. It wasn't quite as green as the other trees. So his son told Al-Muntasir, I think his name was, he said to his father Mutawakkil, why is this tree the way it is now? It's the biggest tree, it's supposed to be the best one. He said to him, Is'al Rabbak, go ask your Lord, meaning Imam al-Hadi alayhi salam, which tells you that the son of Mutawakkil was also one of the Shia of the Imam. So he went to see the Imam. The Imam told him, go tomorrow, dig under the tree, you will find a body there. If your father asks you about this, tell him, remember this advisor that you had who went missing? I found him killed and buried under this tree, which belonged to Al-Mutawakkil, meaning Mutawakkil had him killed and he buried him there. So tell him that's why the tree is yellow and it's not flourishing. So the next day, Muntasir goes there. He's digging under the tree. His father sees him, and he realizes that if he digs deep enough, he's going to find the body, and everyone's going to know that Mutawakkil had his guy killed, and his tribe is going to come asking for him or something like that. So he ran to his son. He said, what are you doing? He said, remember you told me to ask my Lord, ask my God? Well, I asked my Imam, and he told me there is a skull buried underneath this tree that belongs to your wazir that you had, you did the thing with him. You had him killed and whatnot. So he's like, you know what? Please don't tell anyone. Let's just sweep this under the carpet. I will stop attacking your Imam. I will stop attacking you for your fellowship with the Imam. Alayhi salatu wassalam. Final word. Imam al-Hadi, because of the circumstances surrounding his life in Samarra, had begun to establish the network of wukala and fuqaha who would then be delegated with the task of communicating with the Shia and being their ulama and being their maraja. Hence this system that we have today. A system that is extremely robust. A system that has its flaws, no doubt. No one's going to say that these people who are technically fallible, technically they are not inerrant at the end of the day, right? So there are going to be issues, there are going to be problems, there are going to be miscalculations, sure. But, and this is a critical point, Haj Ali, the overall trajectory of the marja'iyah, the overall flow of this system that the Imams established and the Imams backed and supported is a positive one. It is one of the most powerful features of the Shia faith. Without the marja'iyya system, again, I'm not speaking about individual maraja, I'm not speaking about specific problems here or there, but as a system, we have nothing better than this. This is one of the reasons why we have been indestructible. The Shia have been invincible for over 1,400 years because we have pious, good leaders that we refer to. And these leaders receive the backing of the Imam. Again, maybe not as individuals. I wouldn't go as far as to say that each marja has a connection or a direct line with the Imam of the time, but overall the Imam supports the system. So at critical turning points, the Imam of the time will step in. Right? As we know, for example, from the famous story of Sahib Thawrat al-Tambak, al-Mirza al-Shirazi, rahmatullah alayh, who was in Samarra, the marja', the leader of the tobacco revolution, which ended the British Empire's presence in Iran at the time and ultimately Iraq. when they went to him and they said to him, what took you 3 days to issue the fatwa, the famous fatwa against tobacco use, which actually led the concubines in the palace of the Shah in Iran break their, what do you call it, the argila or the shisha, or, I don't know what it's called in English. Whatever it's called, right? They started throwing them from the rooftops because the Marja' in Samarra had issued a decree, a fatwa. The concubines, the wives of the Shah, they went to him 3 days later. They're like, what took you so long? You could have issued this fatwa 3 days ago. He said, he pulled a piece of paper from underneath his mattress. He said, I was waiting for this. And he showed a piece of paper on which the actual handwriting of Imam al-Zaman, or at least that's, he knew that this was from the Imam alayhi salatu wasalam, which spelled out the fatwa. And he said that I told you the fatwa exactly as it was sent to me. My point is that as a system is extremely robust and powerful and positive and incredible, there are some cracks, as there are in everything else. We should strive to solve them, fix them, help things become better. But to undermine the system, to fight the system, to try and, even for people outside the system, to claim that they're trying to reform it or fix it, is a big mistake. If you want to reform anything, you'd have to be qualified as a marja' to begin with. Because reforming the system, it's like saying, I want to reform the medical profession, and you're a plumber. Seriously? How are you going to do that? Or you're a low-ranking alim. You can't do that. You have to be qualified in order to identify the mistakes and then to fix them, inshaAllah.
Ahsan Sayyid, Jazakumullah khair.
Jazakumullah khair. Barakallah feek.
Viewers, thank you for watching. Inshallah, we have clarified for you what a marja' is and why you should follow one. Just one point, if you do see any trees that look a bit yellow, please don't go digging under them to find a dead corpse, because the imam is obviously in his occultation, so you can't come back and say that my imam told me so. But inshallah, that's us for now. Sayyid, Jazakumullah khair jazak for coming. And once again, we apologize for the lengthy episode, but inshallah it was very beneficial. For now, that's us. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Ahsantum, tayyiballahu anfasakum.
اللهم إنا نشكو إليك فقد نبينا صلواتك عليه وآله وغيبة ولينا وكثرة عدونا وقلة عددنا وشدة الفتن بنا وتظاهر الزمان علينا فصل على محمد وآله وعنا على ذلك بفتح منك تعجل وبضر تكشف ونصر تعز وسلطان حق تظهر ورحمة منك تجللنا وعافية منك تلبسنا برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين.